Good morning, everyone, and happy Mother's Day to those of you who are mums. Today I want to speak from the book of Ruth in the Old Testament, the story of a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law who endured some hard times, but also had some amazing, life-transforming experiences. Now, the book is entitled Ruth after the daughter-in-law, but I actually think it could equally be entitled Naomi, because Naomi, the mother-in-law in the story, her circumstances actually kind of bookend the 4 short chapters of this part of the Bible. And it begins terribly, really, with a difficult situation that Naomi and her husband must have needed to make because there was a famine in the land of Israel and they had 2 boys. And so with a dire situation facing them, they make a decision to go to another country, to the land of Moab, to see whether they could scratch out a living there. And so the story begins with them being in Moab, and Moab was kind of an ancient enemy of Israel, and I think that as readers we're meant to be a little bit surprised that they decided to go there. Anyway, there is where they were, and they get on with life, I guess, but terrible events begin to unfold. Firstly, Naomi's husband passes away, and then the Bible says, so do both of her sons. So there she is, a widow having lost her kids in this foreign place called Moab. And Naomi makes a decision to return home and see whether things might go better for her there. So she begins to make her way back from Moab to Israel, and her daughter-in-laws want to come with her, it seems, and one of them decides, okay, maybe I won't, but it's Ruth who says, yes, I will. And in a very important turning point in the story, Ruth aligns herself with Naomi and says, I'm going to go wherever you go, and I'm going to be there for you, and whatever God you serve, I'm going to serve that God. And so Naomi finds in her daughter-in-law Ruth a powerful companion on her journey, on her pilgrimage. And so they take the long road back to Israel. Part of that encounter with Ruth is Naomi saying, look, my name might have been pleasant. That's what Naomi means as a Hebrew name. But she says, I don't want you to call me pleasant anymore. I want you to call me bitter. And so she actually asks to be named Bitter. And they're Bitter and Ruth head back to Israel. Now, why this story is important, I think, is because of the raw nature of Naomi's true emotions as she realizes the extent of her loss. And as a mother, it's a story of terrible grief and absolute lament as she imagines the life that they had when they left Israel all those years ago, and then now what is she left with? Virtually nothing, except for the loyalty of her daughter-in-law Ruth. And so the Bible says these 2 women, strong women, make their way back to Israel. When they arrive to Naomi's home, they use whatever resources they've got, and they realize that they're going to need some more support. They're going to need some resources, some food. And so Naomi says to Ruth, hey, I've got this plan. Why don't you go out and try and find a place to scratch up some grain so that we can eat. Now, in the Old Testament, God made a provision for people who were living in desperate poverty. And that was whenever the harvesters came through harvesting a crop, they weren't to pick up the bits that they accidentally dropped or left behind. They were to be there for people who were in desperate situations. And so Naomi says to Ruth, hey, can you go out and join the people who are scratching out a living, trying to get some of this grain? So Ruth heads out to do this. And in a turning point in the whole story, the Bible has this very curious phrase. It is a phrase that says something like, as it so happened, or it just so turned out that, or as luck would have it, would be another way to interpret what the Bible is saying here. So by whatever reason, chance, or providence, Ruth ends up coming to this field, which is owned by a distant relative of Naomi, and he's a very noble person, and he actually cares for the people that are working for him, and he actually protects women who might have been in a very vulnerable position, being poor and at the mercy of people who own these fields. So anyway, this guy Boaz ends up being a heroic male figure in the story, firstly because he's protecting women and not abusing them, and secondly because he creates a special circumstance for Ruth and provides a way for her to get a little bit of extra grain because he wants to support her, and knowing it or knowing it not, he is supporting Naomi as well. Now, Naomi is at this point surprised and very happy that Ruth just so happens to have landed in the fields of Boaz, and so she sort of stitches up this plan in the hopes that Ruth would end up attracting this man Boaz and that they would get married. So I'm not really going to go into that. You could read the story for yourself, but Naomi's plan works, and Boaz is attracted very much so to Ruth and goes to great lengths to win her over and also to win her hand in marriage. That's a big part of the story of the book of Ruth. And then at the end, Boaz and Ruth having been married, there's this kind of final scene where Naomi has a grandchild bouncing on a knee and is fulfilled with this kind of restoration that again she has family to care for and family to love and who can love her back. And so the scene finishes with Grandma Naomi having the great pleasure of enjoying cuddles of her grandchild. Now, what's fascinating in this whole story is that God is never directly mentioned as being involved in what's going on. His name is evoked in blessings and these sorts of things, but we are never shown that God is directly active in the circumstances of the story. And yet the reader is really left with no other conclusion that in a very subtle way, God has arranged circumstances that to some extent redeem the plight of Naomi and restore a little bit of what she had lost. Now, why I love this story is because it's very real, and it doesn't sort of wallpaper over the tragedy and the loss and the deep grief of this lady Naomi. And many mums, many people have to endure terrible, terrible loss. And they want to rename themselves bitter. Well, that's how they feel anyway. And that the Bible is quite honest and comfortable with the reporting of those feelings of devastation that happen sometime. And I wonder whether, Naomi rehearsed in her head, should we have ever gone to Moab? Was it a mistake? All of those years of loss, did we do something wrong? Well, we're not really told whether that decision was a good one or a bad one. The circumstances, the way things ended up, was certainly really, really bad. But there are a lot of mums and parents who wrestle with, well, should we have done that? Was that right? Did our decision lead to these terrible circumstances? So the grief of people, the grief of parents, is something that this book explores. But it also talks about the power of people that God brings into our life, other people who become part of the family. And that's really Ruth's role in Naomi's life, that she ends up being someone who's loyal to her mother-in-law and is willing to love her and follow her and support her however she can. And it reminds me of surprising people sometimes that come into our life that end up being really pivotal to us, really, really helpful to us in perhaps our recovery. and perhaps moving through grief, or feeling like there is a future and that there's something beyond just this devastation. And so Ruth really plays that role for Naomi of someone who loves her with a loyalty that reflects, I believe, the heart of God for both of these women in this story. That covenant loyalty is very important in this story to why Ruth and Naomi are supported, because Boaz understands that God had made a covenant with Israel, and part of that covenant was that they were to care for poor people and always provide for them. So God's covenant love comes through in Boaz's fidelity to that provision, that law that God made, that people in great need ought to be cared for and their base needs supplied. But also the loyalty of Boaz to follow through on his responsibility to care for Naomi, and that involves what was a real joy to him, and that is to marry Ruth. So there are a lot of these stories that we don't understand unless we understand a little bit of the background of the Bible itself, that bring through the idea of covenant, faithfulness, and loyal love, that are the themes that lead to the recovery, at least to some extent, of poor Naomi. Now, in a surprising twist, perhaps at the very end of the Bible, the narrative having been told, it just lists the relatives of Ruth and Naomi. And this is sort of picked up in the New Testament, because what we come to find is that Ruth is mentioned in the list of the family line of Jesus. And so the faithfulness of all these people to covenant and to one another becomes the background to the person Jesus entering into the world. That his line, at least in human terms, can be traced back to this person, Ruth. So today on Mother's Day, we want to acknowledge the pain and grief of parenthood. We want to acknowledge that not everyone's life is straightforward, and that sometimes people have made decisions, right or wrong, they may never know, that have led to circumstances that have brought grief and difficulty into the lives of others. That's certainly Naomi's story. So we recognize that life isn't often very straightforward, and we don't always get it right, or we don't always know whether our decisions were correct or not, and we have to live with the mystery of that. But also that God is working in the background in all circumstances, and even if we do mess up, God can bring people into our lives who can love us and nurture us in our recovery, such that we do return to some of those simple joys of life, even as we think about Naomi bouncing her grandchild on her knee. How cool is that? So this Mother's Day, I pray that your road is straight, and that you avoid the Moabs if you're tempted to go down the wrong path. But my prayer really is that as mothers today, and as parents, and as people, we recognize that tragedy is a part of life, that we realize that there's sometimes hardships that we have to go through, and we feel like we're abandoned in them, and that life is bitter. But that God can, by his kindness and grace, restore some of the pleasantness and some of the simple joys to our experience as well. So mums, we want to thank you for the tears that you cry, for the burdens that you bear. We want to thank you for the love that you have given us. And we want to pray that we will be loyal people who understand the covenant love of God, and that even if God sometimes doesn't seem to be directly involved in the circumstances of our life, providentially in the background, he can be shaping things up to bring about some return to joy and some sense of his kindness and the goodness of life in this world. So that's the story of Naomi and Ruth, two strong women in the Bible who go through terrible circumstances, but somehow patiently come through them to find that there is yet joy in the end. God bless you. Hey, see ya.